Okay, Matthew, and I've asked your permission because I did see on Twitter that you didn't really want to talk about this. But the amount of abuse I get from people, even though I'm not a bookmaker online, because they're arbing and their account gets closed, the amount of hatred, and I'm going to use that word, from bookmakers about people that arb, it's just something that never ends. So I need you, if possible, to put this to bed once and for all. Are bookmakers just crybabies because they're getting caught on the prices by these arbors? Or are arbors the sort of people that should be thrown in prison and the key chucked away? I mean, which?
Well, there is a duality there, and I'm going to use some bad language and give you the example. So when I rejoined Twitter, I originally had the username @MassiveArber. It's one of those things where, you know, in a bookmaking, you know, setting, if you're on a trading floor and someone said geezers are massive, the unspoken next word is arbor. It's a bit like saying when someone says what a bunch of, you know what the next word's going to come. So, you know, and I go back to my very first experience in a bookmaker, and, you know, taking bets over the phone, and you had this interesting thing whereby your customer would ring up, take the bet, you know, suddenly would shout over from the traders, "What the fuck are you doing? Geezer's a massive fucking arbor. Like, why have you done?" And you're like, "Oh shit, right, okay, I've got to, you know, sorry." And so your first thought is, okay, so these massive arbors, all right, got to be bloody careful of them. And then you'd be down in the pub later, and you'd hear people talking about it, and often people would talk about other people's, like, a lot of talk about other people's punting, like, you know, so-and-so's shrewd, so-and-so's not. And there'd be someone, like, making good amount of money in the office, let's say, and then he'd be like, "Geezer's just a massive arbor, isn't he?" You know, completely like as in, oh, I don't know, he seems to have bought another house with it, just doesn't sound too bad to me. And it's like, you know, it's a completely, you know, and particularly I understood, well, not necessarily agreeing, understood this idea that essentially, you know, particularly people who used to compile their own odds back in the day, the idea of this kind of purist way of making money. I make my own odds, I compare them to the market's odds, I bet whether there's an overlay. You know, this is a true gentleman's battle of contest of wits between, you know, bookmaker and punter. Whereas, you know, arbitrage takes zero effort whatsoever. Essentially, all I need is to have, you know, some way of comparing the odds of A with B. If there's a difference, I bet. And therefore, you know, because no skill is involved, and in particular, no risk. So there's a lot of risk shaming here going on as well. So people are like, you know, if you're not taking any risk, that makes you inferior. And if you don't exhibit any skill, that makes you inferior. From my perspective, that's more the problem of the people making that accusation than the people doing it at the end of the day. For me, I have been incredibly impressed by the thing that always impressed me actually has been execution and scale, ambition if you like. So when you have someone like, you know, Tony Bloom's created, you know, what was Blue Lizard, then Star Lizard, and he's basically making up his own prices and betting into Asia, you know, and, you know, beating the market with better pricing. What really impresses me is, I know people who are doing that with, you know, spreadsheets of an evening, you know, betting into stuff, maybe softer markets than what, well, arguably when Tony started betting, Asia was pretty soft, but, you know, like, betting softer markets, and, you know, they win, like, you know, 5K from their hobby a year, and, like, it's nice. I'm sort of mildly interested, but at the same time, nothing about that sort of makes me sort of astounded. And in the same way, if someone said, like, you know, oh, I've got, you know, Odds Monkey or whatever account, and I make a bit from match betting £5,000, I'm like, all right, to me, it's almost irrelevant. Like, I'm not more impressed than one than the other, particularly. Especially since when you dig down into it, the vast majority of people who are making money are doing it through at least a little bit of advantage, whether it's, you know, favourable each way terms or whatever it may be. So what really impresses me is when you see people really scale it up. So when Tony's making, you know, hundreds of millions out of basically outpricing the market on football, you think that's pretty impressive. But But then when I see people, speaking to people who have done arbitrage on an absolutely industrial scale, people are working against them. People don't want them to do it, and yet they've successfully managed to create. If you told me I made £1 million from betting, and I'm different to most of the Twitterverse here. If you told me you made £1 million from arbing, I'd be equally impressed by that as if you made £1 million from pricing up your own horse racing tissue. And I guarantee you that 100% of gambling Twitter would say what on earth are you talking about? Obviously it's much harder to price up a horse race. That's far greater money earned than the person earned by arbitrage. And it's to be honest, having worked inside bookmakers and outside, done a fair amount of arbitrage myself, it's not easy making £1 million arbing. I guarantee you that they will have had to have done that no one will have given them that money. They will have had to have done some quite clever chicanery to win that amount of money. And I'm interested in those little details. I'm fascinated by the people who, invariably arbitrage people have access to a lot of data because they place thousands of trades, and the way they then leverage that data, instead of modeling horse racing, they're modeling bookmaker behavior, they're modeling market behavior. It's so funny that the next stretch from arbitrage can be market making, and yet if someone said that I made £1 million market making on Betfair, everyone would be like, oh, bravo. So it's kind of one of those things whereby I completely understand bookmakers' frustration with arbitrage, because one thing is that when something is simple, it often scales. And so basically arbitrage has allowed, every, mum's net forum, money saving expert forum, whatever, find a way to make money from slow moving prices essentially. And in terms of should bookmakers be crying? Well, at the end of the day, it's just a fact of life that you're going to have these people. Do I think the bookmakers could have put, a lot of people say better pricing. To be honest, to make really good pricing, have them observed what the effort it takes to make really good pricing. Pinnacle's best customers are arbors. They're money generators, net generators. Not everywhere, not every market, not every sport. It's hard to be, brilliant, but they're net positive for them, good customers. But to get to that, the amount of effort and money that has to be put into making, heat and pressure, to make that diamond is extraordinary. And as long as there is another way for bookmakers to circumnavigate this problem, they're going to want to spend that money in ways that gets more people in the door, especially in very competitive markets. It's really expensive to acquire a customer. So, however, do I think that there are certain things that could be done to mitigate the most basic arbitrage? I am surprised that nothing's been done. One thing I found amusing is that there was a guy whose name I can never remember, but he actually set it up in Ladbrokes. This would have been over a decade ago. Set up in Ladbrokes, where basically set up a Betfair arb bot that would basically ping the markets in Ladbrokes for a couple of quid, I think. And it used to have this funny noise, I think the traders Ladbrokes told me. And every time you heard that noise, you're like, oh, for fuck's sake, like that. And so someone had this idea that traders needed to be constantly notified of when there was arbs against the machine. And at IG Sports, when I worked there, we also set this up whereby we would we would market maker into Betfair. We market made every bloody market in Betfair in £2. Anytime the £2 got snapped up, someone had to go and check the market. So, I do think there are ways that one could mitigate the worst of the arbitrage, and but again, you're spending money, staff costs, people got to check that. But the reality is and the unspoken about problem is that efficient markets, which is what the exchange arbitrage will drive you towards, don't necessarily, or never actually, make you more money. The more efficient the market becomes, the more likely the customer just loses the expected, randomized what the margin is. However, if you allow markets to form around what the recreational bettors want to bet, you actually make more than your margin. So if you know that everyone wants to back Tiger Woods for the Masters, topical for this week, you get far more out of it by being able to lay him at 33 to 1 than the 200 to 1 he should be, or whatever. That's just the reality is that efficient pricing in no way gets you the most reward. And people will say like, oh, but what about the increased volume or whatever? You know, yeah. Well, to be honest, there's a whole other series based on, you know, again, having observed from Pinnacle and from the market maker side on exchanges, getting volume is not, you know, getting bad volume, piece of cake. Getting good volume, constant struggle.
You talked about Pinnacle, and also Pinnacle would love to lay the arbs, like you say. So how much would the business model of just a normal bookmaker active at the moment have to change so that it takes on all comers and still please their investors?
So I think it's feasible to get to the point where you don't have to worry about, does the person who loses 2% a year cover the costs? I think that getting those people on side, I want to think that that's doable. How much money would be required to turn the people who actively win off you into an asset, in terms of converting arbitrage money into positive revenue? I genuinely think that it is very hard to do. I'm just trying to think just in terms of, you know, when I think about the amount of money that's spent in relation to turnover and revenue of, you know, the smarter bookmakers. You know, they have skinnier menus, they offer less markets. There's a reason for that. They maybe don't have the best possible websites, they maybe don't have, you know, like when so much of your money goes on to keeping markets sharpish, then it's hard to sort of have a kind of product that acquires all the other types of customers who couldn't give a crap about, you know, how sharp you are at making prices. So I think that if someone went as far as to make themselves immune to, you know, to monetize arbitrage in the UK, you would end up sacrificing so much of your revenue that you would struggle to get in the good customers in terms of acquiring through good affiliate deals or bonusing or whatever. I think it's very hard. Now, if you create, you know, this is something that was even discussed within, you know, people at you know, Sharp Books, is like, can you just run, you know, Pinnacle as is, you know, in the UK, like it used to be, you know, sort of once upon a time. Again, you really want people to, like, they still want customers in that they can hold high margin against. So you need to offer a lot of live, for example, and the costs of running live have gone up and up. The amount of data people want, etc. Modeling of live costs a lot of money to sort of constantly update it. It's just, I remember speaking to the guys at you know, I was at Mustard when the bookmaker launched. I remember speaking to the, you know, the people who owned Mustard as a bookmaker, and they had positive trading P&L, so positive hold against the initial Mustard customers were all just incredibly smart UK punters. Positive trading P&L, and once you took out all the costs, it just wasn't an interesting business. It wasn't a business that would get anyone excited who had enough money to start up a business in the first place. You need a degree of, like, someone who wants to do it because of the passion for it. You know, Darren Revile who owns, is it Darren? No, it's not Darren Revile. Derek Stevens, sorry. That is a terrible error. I did not say Darren Revile owns Circa. Derek Stevens who owns Circa, right? You know, he clearly has a real passion for the sportsbook there being, you know, or Joe Brennan Jr. who owns, you know, Prime Sportsbook, whatever. They really are passionate about running a business. And I'm convinced that for the same amount of money they invest in those businesses, they probably could get a higher return, but they want to be doing that business, and all power to them for that.